All right, welcome everyone to the new JFK Show number 252. We're rolling along and we've got a skeleton crew tonight with Dr. James Fetzer. All right, tonight we're going to talk about the end result of all this, and we're going to get Dr. Fetzer to read this letter here from John Kennedy to Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. So go ahead there, Dr. Fetzer. Let's roll.
I can't see it, Gary. You got to do the screen share.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Here we go. And here's the letter. Verbatim text.
Ooh, wow.
All right, let's roll.
Dear Mr. Prime Minister, I welcome your letter of May 12th and am giving it careful study. Meanwhile, I have received from Ambassador Barbour a report of his conversation with you on May 14th regarding the arrangements for visiting the Dimona reactor. I would like to add some personal comments on that subject. I'm sure you will agree that there is no more urgent business for the whole world than the control of nuclear weapons. We both recognize this when we talked together 2 years ago, and I emphasized it again when I met with Mrs. Mayer just after Christmas. The dangers of the proliferation of national nuclear weapon systems are so obvious that I am sure I need not repeat them here. It is because of our preoccupation with this problem that my government has sought to arrange with you for periodic visits to Dimona. When we spoke together in May 1961, you said that we might make whatever use we wished of the information resulting from the first visit of American scientists to Dimona, and that you would agree to further visit by neutrals as well. I had assumed from Mrs. Mayer's comment that there would be no problem between us on this. We are concerned with the disturbing effects on world stability which would accompany the development of a nuclear weapons capability by Israel. I cannot imagine that the Arabs would refrain from turning to the Soviet Union for assistance if Israel were to develop a nuclear weapons capability, with all the consequences this would hold. But the problem is much larger than its impact on the Middle East. Development of a nuclear weapons capability by Israel would almost certainly lead other larger countries that have so far refrained from such development to feel that they must follow suit. As I made clear in my press conference on May 8th, we have a deep commitment to the security of Israel. In addition, this country supports Israel in a wide variety of other ways, which are well known to both of us. 4.5 lines of source text, still not declassified. I can well appreciate your concern for developments in the UAR, United Arab Republic, but I see no present or imminent nuclear threat to Israel from there. I am assured that our intelligence on this question is good and that the Egyptians do not presently have any installation comparable to Dimona, nor any facilities potentially capable of nuclear weapons production. But of course, if you have information that would support a contrary conclusion, I would like to receive it from you through Ambassador Barbour. We have the capacity to check it. I trust this message will convey the sense of urgency and the perspective in which I view your government's early assent to the proposal, first put to you by Ambassador Barbour on April 2nd. Sincerely,
John F. Kennedy. All right, now this is from the Jewish Virtual Library, if anyone's questioning where we got this information. All right. Next up, there's a website called jfkennedy.net. And this is, we're going to give kudos to Michael Collins Piper for doing a lot of this. As far as the author, I've not been able to find who it is, but you can find it yourself. So let's go with this one, Dr. Fetzer.
Mossad and the JFK assassination. Israel need not apologize for the assassination or destruction of those who seek to destroy it. The first order of business for any country is the protection of its people. Washington Jewish Week, October 9th, 1997. Gary, that's like they're saying they participated and they're not even apologetic.
You don't even have to read between the lines too much. This is a powerful article, and this is when we're getting serious over here. And there's no one else that are really trying to get serious about JFK, but we are, damn it. So
In March 1992, Illinois Representative Paul Finley said in the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, "It is interesting but not surprising to note that in all the words written and uttered about the Kennedy assassination, Israel's intelligence agency, the Mossad, has never been mentioned. Considering that the Mossad is quite possibly the most ruthless and efficient intelligence agency in the world, it's peculiar that they have never been scrutinized in relation to the Kennedy assassination, especially when practically every other entity in the world, short of Elvis impersonators, has been implicated." But that all changed in January 1994 with the release of Michael Collins Piper's Final Judgment. In this book, Piper says, Israel's Mossad was a primary and critical behind-the-scene player in the conspiracy that ended the life of JFK. Through its own vast resources and through its international contacts in the intelligence community and organized crime, Israel had the means, it had the opportunity, and it had the motive to play a major frontline role in the crime of the century, and it did. Their motive? Israel's much-touted Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who ruled the country from its inception in 1948 until he resigned on June 16, 1963, was so enraged at John F. Kennedy for not allowing Israel to become a nuclear power that, Collins asserts in his final days in office, he commanded the Mossad to become involved in a plot to kill America's president. Ben-Gurion was so convinced that Israel's very survival was in dire jeopardy that in one of his final letters to JFK, he said, "Mr. President, my people have the right to exist, and this existence is in danger." In the days leading up to Ben-Gurion's resignation from office, he and JFK had been involved in an unpublicized, contentious debate over the possibility of Israel getting nuclear capabilities. Their disagreement eventually escalated into a full-fledged war of words that was virtually ignored in the press. Ethan Bronner wrote about this secret battle between JFK and Ben-Gurion years later in a New York Times article on October 31st, 1998, calling it a fiercely hidden subject. In fact, the Kennedy-Ben-Gurion conversations are still classified by the United States government. Maybe this is the case because Ben-Gurion's rage and frustration became so intense and his power so great within Israel that Piper contends it was at the center of the conspiracy to kill John Kennedy. This stance is supported by New York banker Abe Feinberg, who describes the situation as such. Ben-Gurion could be vicious, and he had such a hatred of the old man, Joe Kennedy Sr., JFK's father. Ben-Gurion despised Joe Kennedy because they felt that he not only was anti-Semitic, but that he had also sided with Hitler during the 1930s and 40s. We will touch upon this aspect of the story in an upcoming article entitled "The CIA and Organized Crime, Two Sides of the Same Coin." Anyway, Ben-Gurion was convinced that Israel needed nuclear weapons to ensure its survival, while Kennedy was dead set against it. This inability to reach an agreement caused obvious problems. One of them revolved around Kennedy's decision that he would make America his top priority in regard to foreign policy and not Israel. Kennedy planned to honor the 1950 Tripartite Declaration, which said the United States would retaliate against any nation in the Middle East that attacked any other country. Ben-Gurion, on the other hand, wanted the Kennedy administration to sell them offensive weapons, particularly Hawk missiles. The two leaders thus engaged in a brutal letter exchange, but Kennedy wouldn't budge. Ben-Gurion, obsessed by this issue, slipped into total paranoia, feeling that Kennedy's obstinance was a blatant threat to the very existence of Israel as a nation. Piper writes, Ben-Gurion had developed a lifetime creating a Jewish state and guiding it into the world arena. And in Ben-Gurion's eyes, John F. Kennedy was an enemy of the Jewish people in his beloved state of Israel. He continues, a nuclear option was not only at the very core of Ben-Gurion's personal worldview, but the very foundation of Israel's national security policy. Ben-Gurion was so preoccupied with obtaining nuclear weapons that on June 27, 1963, 11 days after resigning from office, he announced, "I do not know if any other nation whose neighbors declare that they wish to terminate it, and not only declare but prepare for it by all means available to them. We must have no illusions that what is declared every day in Cairo, Damascus, and Iraq are just words. This is the thought that guides the Arab leaders. I am confident that science is able to provide us with the weapons that will serve the peace and deter our enemies." Avner Cohen in Israel and the Bomb, published by Columbia University Press, reinforces this sense of urgency by writing, "Imbued with lessons of the Holocaust, Ben-Gurion was consumed by fears of security. Anxiety about the Holocaust reached beyond Ben-Gurion to infuse Israel's military thinking." He further adds fuel to this point by pointing out Ben-Gurion had no qualms about Israel's need for weapons of mass destruction, and Ben-Gurion's worldview and his decisive governing style shaped his critical role in instigating Israel's nuclear progress. Kennedy, on the other hand, was adamant in his refusal to promote Israel's ascension to the nuclear stage. Avner Cohen in Israel and the Bomb stresses, "No American president was more concerned with the danger of nuclear proliferation than John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He was convinced that the spread of nuclear weapons would make the world more dangerous and undermine U.S. interest." Cohen continues at the end of this passage, "The only example Kennedy used to make this point was Israel." Realizing that Kennedy would not change his mind, Ben-Gurion decided to join forces with Communist China. Both countries were greatly interested in creating nuclear programs, and so began their secret joint dealings. Working in unison through intermediate Shaul Eisenberg, who was a partner of Mossad gunrunner and accountant Timur Rosenbaum, Israel and China proceeded to develop their own nuclear capabilities without the knowledge of the United States. If you find this scenario improbable, I strongly urge you to read Gordon Thomas's excellent book, Seeds of Fire, where he exposes how the Mossad and CSIS, Chinese Secret Service, have conspired on many occasions to not only steal American military secrets, but to also doctor U.S. intelligence programs such as the Justice Department's Promise software. This instance, I am afraid to say, is but the first where echoes of the JFK assassination can still be felt today reverberating through our post-9/11 world. The dangers of Israel developing the bomb in unison with China became a highly volatile situation and was closely monitored by the CIA. Intent on pursuing this path, the Israelis constructed a nuclear facility at Dimona. When Kennedy demanded that the U.S. inspect this plant, Ben-Gurion was so incensed that he erected another phony facility that held no evidence of nuclear research and development. Does this scenario sound eerily familiar to the game we're playing with Saddam Hussein in Iraq right now? Fully aware of their shenanigans, though, JFK told Charles Bartlett, "The sons of bitches lie to me constantly about their nuclear capability." Avner Cohen in Israel and the Bomb reiterates this claim by saying that Ben-Gurion had taken the nuclear issue so closely to heart that he concluded he could not tell the truth about Dimona to American leaders, not even in private. Dr. Gerald N. Steinberg, political science professor at Bar Ilan University's Bessa Center for Strategic Studies in Tel Aviv, weighs in by saying, between 1961 and 1963, the Kennedy administration placed a great deal of pressure on Ben-Gurion in the effort to pressure for acceptance of international inspection of Dimona and Israeli abdication of their nuclear weapons. This pressure apparently did not alter Israeli policy, but was a contributing factor to Ben-Gurion's resignation in 1963. To convey how serious the situation had become in modern terms, look at what is happening in Iraq with United Nations security teams inspecting the royal palaces and bunkers for nuclear weapons and materials. This matter is so urgent that our nation is on the verge of war. 40 years earlier, the heat that JFK was placed on Ben-Gurion was equally as strong as what George Bush is laying on Saddam Hussein today. In Israel and the Bomb, Abner Cohen reinforces this point. To force Ben-Gurion to accept the conditions, Kennedy exerted the most useful leverage available to an American president in dealing with Israel, a threat that an unsatisfactory solution would jeopardize the U.S. government's commitment to and support of Israel. The pressure on Ben-Gurion was so immense that he ended up leaving office. But Kennedy, in true pit bull style, didn't let up on Ben-Gurion's successor, Levi Eshkol, as Abner Cohen reports. Kennedy told Eshkol that the U.S. commitment in support of Israel could be seriously jeopardized if Israel did not let the U.S. obtain reliable information about its efforts in the nuclear field. Kennedy's demands were unprecedented. They amounted, in effect, to an ultimatum. Cohen concludes this thought by asserting, Kennedy's letter precipitated a near-crisis situation in Eshkol's office. In the end, as we're all aware, Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. What less known is that China conducted its first nuclear test in October 1964. What makes this event more profound is Piper's claim that even though Israel said its first nuclear test took place in 1979, they actually occurred in October 1964, along with the Chinese. If this is true, other than August 1945, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, October 1964 may possibly be the most dangerous month in 20th century history. Let's return, though, to JFK's assassination and the direct results of it in regard to the Jewish lobby, American foreign policy, and the militarization of Israel. To understand how powerful the Israeli lobby is in this country, Venerable Senator J. William Fulbright told CBS Face the Nation on April 15, 1973, Israel controls the U.S. Senate. The Senate is subservient, much too much. We should be more concerned about U.S. interests rather than doing the bidding of Israel. The great majority of the Senate of the U.S., somewhere around 80%, is completely in support of Israel. Anything Israel wants, Israel gets. This has been demonstrated time and time again, and this has made foreign policy difficult for our government. Do you hear what Senator Fulbright said? This isn't a crazy conspiracy theorist or KKK anti-Semite. It's a much respected US senator saying that about 80% of the Senate is in Israel's hip pocket. Adding clout to this argument is Representative Paul Finlay, who was quoted in the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs in March 1992. During John Kennedy's campaign for the presidency, a group of New York Jews had privately offered to meet his campaign expenses if he would let them set his Middle East policy. He did not agree. As a president, he provided only limited support of Israel. To understand how important Kennedy's decisions were during his short-lived presidency, we have to look at the issue of campaign finance. Considering how influenced the Israeli lobby is in the US Senate, hearkening back to the words of Senator Fulbright, they had to have been enraged when President Kennedy genuinely wanted to cut the knees out from under the current campaign finance methods because it made politicians so reliant upon the huge cash inlays of special interest groups. Regrettably, Kennedy did not have the time to implement this program, and to this day, our political system is still monopolized by lobbyists from the very same special interest groups. One can only imagine what changes would have occurred in relation to our foreign policy had Kennedy eradicated these vipers and bloodsuckers from the halls of Congress. Tragically, Kennedy's ideas never came to fruition, and a heated battle with Prime Minister Ben-Gurion over whether Israel should be allowed to develop a nuclear program was ultimately lost. The reason why is that Lyndon Baines Johnson, who Kennedy intended to drop from his ticket in 1964 due to his extreme dislike for, had a complete reversal in foreign policy, as you will see. Not only did Israel's nuclear program move ahead unchecked, they also became the prime beneficiary of our foreign aid. But this absolute turnaround would not have occurred if Kennedy would not have been assassinated. Up until LBJ became president, Kennedy dealt with the Middle East in a way that most benefited the US. His primary goal, and one which would keep most keep the peace was a balance of power in the Middle East so that each and every nation would be secure. This decision adhered to the tripartite declaration, which the U.S. signed in 1950. But under the Johnson administration, this fragile balance was overturned, and by 1967, only 4 years after Kennedy's assassination, the U.S. was Israel's main weapons supplier, and our best interests were put well behind those of Israel. As Michael Collins Piper writes, the bottom line is this: JFK was adamantly determined to stop Israel from building the nuclear bomb. LBJ simply looked the other way. JFK's death did indeed prove beneficial to Israel's nuclear ambitions, and the evidence proves it. Reuven Paditzer, in a review of Abner Cohen's Israel and the Bomb in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz on February 5th, 1999, wrote, "The murder of American President John F. Kennedy brought to an abrupt end the massive pressure being applied by the U.S. administration on the government of Israel to discontinue their nuclear program." He continued, "Kennedy made it quite clear to the Israeli prime minister that he would not, under any circumstances, agree to Israel becoming a nuclear state." Peditzer concludes, had Kennedy remained alive, it is doubtful whether Israel would today have a nuclear option, and that Ben-Gurion's decision to resign in 1963 was taken to a large extent against the background of the tremendous pressure that Kennedy was applying on him concerning the nuclear issue. If you're still not convinced, how about some numbers? In Kennedy's last fiscal budget year of 1964, Israeli aid was $40 million. In LBJ's first budget of 1965, it soared to $71 million. And in 1966, more than tripled from 2 years earlier to $130 million. Plus, during Kennedy's administration, almost none of our aid to Israel was military in nature. Instead, it was split equally between development loans and food assistance under the PL 480 program. Yet in 1965, under the Johnson administration, 20% of our aid to Israel was for the military, while in 1966, 71% was used for war-related materials. Continuing in this same vein, in 1963, the Kennedy administration sold 5 Hawk missiles to Israel as part of an air defense system. In 1965-66, though, LBJ laid 250 tanks on Israel, 48 Skyhawk attack aircraft, plus guns and artillery, which were all offensive in nature. If you ever wondered when the Israeli war machine was created, this is it. LBJ was its father. According to Stephen Green in Taking Sides, America's Secret Relations with a Militant Israel, the $92 million in military assistance provided in fiscal year 1966 was greater than the total of all official military aid provided to Israel cumulatively in all the years going back to the foundation of that nation in 1948. Green continues, 70% of all U.S. official assistance to Israel has been military. America has given Israel over $17 billion in military aid since 1946, virtually all of which, over 99%, has been provided since 1965. Can you see what's happening here? Within 2 years of JFK's assassination, Israel went from being a weak, outmatched member of the volatile Middle Eastern community that was not allowed to develop nuclear weapons to one that was well on its way to becoming an undeniable military force on the world stage. John Kennedy adamantly put his foot down and refused to allow Israel to develop a nuclear program, while LBJ bent over backwards to facilitate and bolster them. Or, as Seymour Hersh wrote in The Samson Option, by 1968, the president had no intention of doing anything to stop the Israeli bomb. The result of this shift in focus from the Kennedy to Johnson administration is, in my opinion, the primary reason behind our current troubles in the Middle East, which culminated in the 9/11 attacks and our upcoming war with Iraq and beyond. I have a great deal of confidence in the statement, for as Michael Collins Piper points out, here are the results of John Kennedy's assassination. 1, our foreign and military aid to Israel increased dramatically once LBJ became president. 2, Rather than trying to maintain a balance in the Middle East, Israel suddenly emerged as a dominant force. 3, since the LBJ administration, Israel has always had weaponry that was superior to any of its direct neighbors. 4, due to this undeniable and obvious increase in Israel's war machine, a constant struggle has been perpetuated in the Middle East. 5, LBJ also allowed Israel to proceed with its nuclear development, resulting in them becoming the 6th largest nuclear force in the world. 6, finally, our huge outlays of foreign aid to Israel, approximately $10 billion a year, when all is said and done, has created a situation of never-ending attacks and retaliation in the Middle East, plus outright scorn and enmity against the U.S. for playing the role of Israel's military enabler. In Israel's, and especially David Ben-Gurion's eyes then, what were their alternatives? To remain weakened or at least balanced in relation to their neighbors and handcuffed by JFK's refusal to bow to their will, or kill the one man standing in their way to becoming dominant in the Middle East, the recipient of huge amounts of military aid, and one of the premier nuclear forces in the world? It's something to think about. Also, while these thoughts are running through your head, ask yourself this question. If Kennedy, LBJ, and all subsequent administrations would have adhered to the 1950 Tripartite Declaration and done everything in their power to maintain balance in the Middle East instead of pushing Israel to the forefront, would our towers have been attacked on 9/11, 2001? And would we be on the verge of a possibly catastrophic war today? It's certainly something to ponder.
So, what's your feelings about that? Sometimes you come across an article that just says it all, and I can't disagree with anything.
That's a superior article, Gary. I'm very glad you had me read it. I think it makes a very persuasive case. And Lyndon, of course, was the prime mover. Israel was only one of the sponsors, but an important one. And, you know, it's a very important piece of the background to understand the puzzle, the enigma, the greatest murder mystery in world history.
Right, and the conversations between Kennedy and Ben-Gurion are still classified, quite a bit of it. So that should tell you a lot right there. Now, let's go ahead and let's fast forward to today, or not quite today. This list is a little old. However, I think it's still most important. Okay, talking, and believe it or not, it's going to be illegal, or may well be, for you to use the term dual citizen. I've heard that there's legislation that is pending or has passed against that. All right, so I'm going to name a couple of names, but just look at the positions here. You know, the U.S. Attorney General, U.S. Attorney for Crime Division, Michael Chertoff, Richard Pearl, you know, the president's advisor, Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Defense Secretary, all Israeli American citizens.
Yeah, these were all key players on 9/11. These were, you know, members of the Department of Defense or the Department of Justice who played a role in orchestrating the new Pearl Harbor.
So it's not that big of a jump from what the article you just read to see who was involved in 9/11. We've got the Defense Intelligence Agency analysts.
You can roll it back, Gary, and I'll read it from Mukasey on if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there?
So you might ask, are there any other dual Israeli American citizens who hold U.S. government positions that could compromise American security? Yes, considering the following list that I obtained on the web. Now, this is all at the time of the Bush-Cheney administration. Michael Mukasey, recently appointed U.S. Attorney General. Mukasey was also a judge in the litigation between developer Larry Silverstein and several insurance companies arising from the destruction of the World Trade Center. Michael Chertoff, former Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division at the Justice Department, now head of Homeland Security. Richard Pearl, one of Bush's foreign policy advisors. He's chairman of the Pentagon Defense Policy Board, a very likely Israeli government agent. Pearl was expelled from Senator Henry Jackson's office in the 1970s after the National Security Agency caught him passing highly classified national security documents to the Israeli embassy. He later worked for the Israeli weapons firm Soltam Pearl came from one of the above-mentioned pro-Israeli think tanks, the AEI. I think that's American Enterprise Institute. Pearl is one of the leading pro-Israeli fanatics leading this Iraq warmongering within the administration and now in the media, Paul Wolfowitz. Former Deputy Defense Secretary and member of Pearl's Defense Policy Board. In the Pentagon, Wolfowitz is a close associate of Pearl and reportedly has close ties to the Israeli military. His sister lives in Israel. Wolfowitz came from the above-mentioned Jewish think tank, JINSA. Wolfowitz was the #2 member within the administration behind this Iraq warmongering. He later was appointed head of the World Bank, where he resigned under pressure from World Bank members over a scandal involving his misuse of power. Douglas Feith, Undersecretary of Defense and Policy Advisor at the Pentagon. He is a close associate of Pearl and served as special counsel. Like Pearl and the others, Feith is a pro-Israel extremist who has advocated anti-Arab policies in the past. He is closely associated with the extremist group, the Zionist Organization of America, which even attacks Jews that don't agree with its extremist views. Feith frequently speaks at Zionist Organization of America conferences. Feith runs a small law firm, Feith and Zell, which has only one international office in Israel. The majority of their legal work is representing the Israeli interests. His firm's own website stated prior to his appointment that Feith represents Israeli armaments manufacturer. Feith basically represents the Israeli war machine. Feith also came from the Jewish think tank JINSA. Feith, like Pearl and Wolfowitz, campaigning hard for this Israeli proxy war against Israel. Lawrence Larry Franklin, the former Defense Intelligence Agency analyst with expertise in Iranian policy issues, who worked in the Office of Undersecretary of State of Defense for Policy Douglas Feith and reported directly to Feith Deputy Willem Luty, was sentenced January 20th, 2006 to more than 12 years in prison for giving classified information to an Israeli diplomat and members of the pro-lobby Israel lobbying group, American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. Franklin will remain free while the government continues with a wider case, and his prison time would be sharply reduced in return for his help in prosecuting former AIPAC members Stephen J. Rosen and Keith Weissman, who are scheduled to go to trial in April 2006. Franklin admitted that he met periodically with Rosen and Weissman between 2002 and 2004 and discussed classified information, including information about potential attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq. Rosen and Weissman would later share what they learned with reporters and Israeli officials. Edward Lutwak, member of the National Security Study Group in the Department of Defense at the Pentagon. Lutwak is reportedly an Israeli citizen and is taught in Israel. He frequently writes for Israeli and pro-Israeli newspapers and journals. Lutwak is an Israeli extremist whose main theme in many of his articles is the necessity of the U.S. waging war against Iraq and Iran. Henry Kissinger.
Ooh.
One of the many Pentagon advisors, Kissinger sits on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl. For detailed information about Kissinger's evil past, read Seymour Hersh's book, Price of Power, Kissinger in the Nixon White House. Kissinger likely had a part in the Watergate crimes, Southeast Asia mass murders, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, installing Chilean mass murdering dictator Pinochet, Operation Condor's mass killings of South America, and more recently served as Serbia's ex-dictator Slobodan Milosevic's advisor. He constantly advocated going to war against Iraq. Kissinger is the Ariel Sharon of the U.S. Unfortunately, President Bush nominated Kissinger as chairman of the September 11th Investigating Commission. It's like picking a bank robber to investigate a fraud scandal. He later declined this job under enormous protest. Dov Zakheim is an ordained rabbi and repeatedly holds Israeli citizenship. Zakheim attended Jews College in London and became an ordained Orthodox Jewish rabbi in 1973. He was adjunct professor at New York's Jewish Yeshiva University. Zakheim is close to the Israeli lobby. Dov Zakheim is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and in 2000, the co-author of the project for the New American Century's position paper, Rebuilding America's Defenses, advocating the necessity for a post-Pearl-like Harbor-like incident to mobilize a country into war with its enemies, mostly Middle Eastern Muslim nations. He was appointed by Bush as Pentagon controller from May 4th, 2001 to March 10th, 2004. At that time, he was unable to explain the disappearance of $1 trillion. Actually, nearly 3 years later, Donald Rumsfeld announced on September 10th, 2001, that an audit discovered $2.3 trillion was also missing from the Pentagon's books. That story, as mentioned, was buried under 9/11's rubble. The two sums disappeared on Zuckheim's watch. We can only guess where that cash went. Despite these suspicions, on May 6, 2004, Zuckheim took a lucrative position at Booz Allen Hamilton, one of the most prestigious strategy consulting firms in the world. One of its clients then was Blessed Relief, a charity said to be a front for Osama bin Laden. Booz Allen and Hamilton then also worked closely with DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is the research arm of the Department of Defense. Judicial Incorporated bio of Dove tells us Zuckheim is a dual Israeli-American citizen and has been tracking the halls of U.S. government for 25 years, casting defense policy and influence on Presidents Reagan, Clinton, Bush Sr., and Bush Jr. Judicial Inc. points out that most of Israelis' armaments were gotten there thanks to him. Squads of US F-16 and F-15 were classified military surplus and sold to Israel at a fraction of their value. Kenneth Adelman, one of many Pentagon advisors, Adelman also sits on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl and is another extremist pro-Israeli advisor who supported going to war against Iraq. Adelman frequently is a guest on Fox News and often expresses extremist and often ridiculous anti-Arab and anti-Muslim views. Through his racism or ignorance, he actually calls Arabs anti-Semitic. On Fox News, when he could have looked up the dictionary that find Arabs by definition are Semites. I. Lewis Scooter Libby, Vice President Dick Cheney's ex-chief of staff, is chief pro-Israeli Jewish advisor to Cheney and helps explain why Cheney is so gung-ho to invade Iran. Libby is longtime associate of Wolfowitz. Libby was also a lawyer for convicted felon and Israeli spy Mark Rich, whom Clinton pardoned in his last days as president. Libby was recently found guilty of lying to federal investigators in the Valerie Plame affair, in which Plame, a covert CIA agent, was exposed for political revenge by the Bush administration following her husband's revelation about the lies leading to the Iraq War. Robert Satioff, the U.S. National Security Advisor, Satioff was the executive director of the Israeli lobby's think tank, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Many of the Israeli lobby's experts come from this front group, like Martin Indite, Elliot Abrams. National Security Council advisor, he previously worked at Washington-based think tank Ethics and Public Policy Center. During the Reagan administration, Abrams was the Assistant Secretary of State, handling, for the most part, Latin American affairs. He played an important role in the Iran-Contra scandal, which involved illegally selling U.S. weapons to Iran to fight Iraq, and illegally funding the Contra rebels fighting to overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinista government. He also actively deceived 3 congressional committees about his involvement and thereby faced felony charges based on his testimony. Abrams pled guilty in 1991 to 2 misdemeanors and was sentenced to a year's probation and 100 hours of community service. A year later, former President Bush Sr. granted Abrams a full pardon. He was one of the more hawkish pro-Israeli Jews in the Reagan administration's Department of State. Mark Grossman, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. He was Director General of Foreign Service and Director of Human Resources at the Department of State. Grossman is one of many of the pro-Israeli Jewish officials from the Clinton administration Bush has promoted to higher posts. Richard Haas, Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and Ambassador at Large. He's also Director of National Security Programs and Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was one of the more hawkish pro-Israeli Jews in the first Bush Sr. administration who sat on the National Security Council and who consistently advocated going to war against Iraq. Haas is also a member of the Defense Department's National Security Study Group at the Pentagon. Robert Zolnick, U.S. Trade Representative, a cabinet-level position. He's also one of the more hawkish pro-Israeli Jews in the Bush Jr. administration who advocated invading Iraq and occupying a portion of the country in order to set up a Vichy-style puppet government. He consistently advocates going to war against Iran. Ari Fleischer, ex-White House spokesman for the Bush Jr. administration, prominent in the Jewish community. Some reports say he holds Israeli citizenship. Fleischer is closely connected to the extremist Jewish group called the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidics, who follow the Kabbalah and hold very extremist and insulting views of non-Jews. Fleischer was co-president of Shabbat's Capital Jewish Forum. He received the Young Leadership Award from the American Friends of Lubavitch in October 2001. James Schlesinger, one of many Pentagon advisors. Schlesinger also sits on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl and is another extreme pro-Israeli advisor who supported going to war against Iraq. Schlesinger is also a commissioner of the Defense Department's National Security Study Group at the Pentagon. David Flume, White House speechwriter behind the Axis of Evil label, he lumped together all the lies and accusations against Iraq for Bush to justify the war. Joshua Bolten, White House Deputy Chief of Staff. Bolton was previously a banker, former legislative aide, and prominent in the Jewish community. John Bolton, former UN representative and Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Bolton is also a senior advisor to President Bush. Prior to this position, Bolton was senior vice president of the above-mentioned pro-Israeli think tank, AEI. He recently, October 2002, accused Syria of having a nuclear program so that they can attack Syria after Iraq. He must have forgot that Israel has 400 nuclear weapons, some of which are thermonuclear weapons, according to a recent U.S. Air Force report. David Wimser, Special Assistant to John Bolton, the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. Wimser also worked at the AEI with Pearl and Borton. His wife, Meirav Wimser, along with Colonel Yigal Cameron, formerly of Israeli military intelligence, co-founded the Middle East Media Research Institute, MEMRI, a Washington-based Israeli outfit which distributes articles translated from Arabic newspapers portraying Arabs in a bad light. I think we got the idea, Gary. We got the idea. This is absolutely stunning stuff. And of course, it's a total indictment of the infestation of the American government by the Israelis.
Yeah, it's just amazing. And we can, all the advisors, these are all dual American citizens, which is becoming a crime where you can actually be arrested or can face some sort of punishment. I read an article about that not long ago where I think it was one of our congressmen or something like that, and he mentioned the word dual citizen, and they came down on him hard. I really wish I would have that article in front of me. So if you're wondering what happened to our country, then there you have it.
I think these were extremely important reports you had me read, Gary, and that they are indispensable to understanding the transition from JFK to where we are today.
Yeah,
So I'm very glad that you had me do this. I mean, look, John Bolton was just fired by Donald Trump as his national security advisor.
Oh yeah, these guys are not gone by any means. Even Henry Kissinger's still around.
It's unbelievable, unbelievable.
And just as a side note, I challenge anyone to go and look for a picture of Henry Kissinger with John F. Kennedy. And up until this day, I have not found one. However, I can find you a picture of every single president since Johnson all the way to Trump. I can find a picture of Henry Kissinger with every single president to this day.
Yes, of course, Gary.
So,
look, I'll tell you, this is a lot to absorb, and I think it's a terribly important message. There's a great deal of dense information here that's indispensable to understanding why the world is in the terrible mess it's in today, Gary. I thank you for bringing this up.
And John F. Kennedy was, like he said, a pit bull and was not going to have any of it. And the day he died is the day that this huge transition, which was already underway decades before, and they were not going to stop with just one man who who had an idea of peace. You know what happens to the people that sing and talk about peace. All right, Dr. Fetzer, JFK number 252. I thank you very much. And how did you go that long reading without stumbling one time? Just amazing.
Thanks,
If I would have
Gary.
read it, it wouldn't have been so good. All right, Dr. Fetzer, we'll see you next time.